We're now in the garden attached to Moorehall house. The garden would have originated perhaps 50 years after the house was built. It's an enclosed garden with a high wall around it, and it's extent of about 3¼ acres, I think. And I'm in a fairly strong position to talk about this garden because when I was a young lad, my people had the use of the garden after the house ceased to be occupied. What I saw when I was a young lad was not terribly different, I think, to what George and Morris talks about when they were middle-aged men walking around through this garden, and they described it then as derelict. So it was slightly more derelict, I suppose, when I got to know it in the 1930s. But it consisted of a mixture of fruit and vegetables, and there was an area in it that was described as Mrs. Moore's flower garden. That would be George Henry's Mrs. Moore, I think. And the garden, the remains of the flower garden were even there in my young days. In my young days we had apples and gooseberries and plums and pears. There's a sketch of the garden as we tried to reenact it in existence, and it shows fairly accurately the layout of the garden at the time. It had a fairly narrow strip with a box edging, and a roadway, with a pathway going down to the gate below, and going across to the other side of the garden, and the same down the far side. And along there, on mostly on the far side, I can remember, there were apple trees, and up into the top of the garden, and there was a dividing line there, as I say, with Mrs. Moore's flower garden. In George's chat with Morris in his Hail and Farewell Valley to a huge walnut tree that was over there, and maybe my imagination now, but I do believe that there was a walnut tree there when I was a young lad. We're down just as you enter the stable. It's difficult to visualize the extent of that racing element in the Moore saga. I mentioned Crowpatrick, the horse called Crowpatrick. He won the Stewards' Cup in Goodwood. And Master George won a race in Leicester. And Corona, of course, is perhaps the most famous of them from a social point of view. he won £17,000 in winning the Chester Cup, and the proceeds of the winnings were devoted to famine relief. That, naturally enough, is supposed to have had a major effect in saving a lot of the people from the rigours of the famine. In today's money, it would be regarded as about £1 million. My memory is that the stables were still there when I was a young lad, the same stables in which those famous horses were. I milked cows in the stables, and I would have 2 big cans of milk, and as a teenager, or early teenage, I would have to walk from here over to our house over at the road. And there was a path, and a mucky old path it was, right across to our house. My father would have to do that regularly in relation to coming and going. So it was no wonder the poor man died at age 69 from a kidney complaint, from wettings and hardship generally, which was a feature of a farmer's existence in those days. My father was a professional gardener, and he came into the farming when the Moor estate was divided, and he got 50 acres rough and smooth, and that was when coming up to the 1930, coming up to 1930. 7 of us were survived on it. So the area over to my right here is the open area that, with the wall, is the gap in the wall was an archway gate in my time with a big wooden gateway into the garden. And one problem we used to have was that, naturally enough, the orchard was raided by the local kids, and we used to lose some apples in that way. Otherwise, we used to have enough apples to keep us going until Christmas, and it was very good. So it was reared on apple tarts and pies and one thing and another. And nice eating apples as well. Beauty of Bath and Cox's Orange Pippin and apples like that. We're at the junction between the exit on the farmyard side from the tunnel at the rear of the big house, as we used to call it, and at a junction with the road we used to call the Dark Road. The tunnel itself was a means for the transport of the day and access from the stable area over into this farmyard area here, which is on my right. And the entrance to the basement of the house and the servants' entrance, and there's a suggestion in some of these big houses, the servants were never visible in the upper areas of the house. They were always down in the basement and the kitchen area. And perhaps that was part of the construction of this house here. I wished I had a £20 note for every time I went through that tunnel with cattle and horses and asses and carts and traps. And when we had the use of the stables over yonder, you see, you did, when you were coming or going from our farm was back west of us here, so bringing the cows in the evening, you had to bring them in through here and in through the tunnel. So it was a regular activity for us. behind my back is the building that in my young day we called the barn. There was a walled area to my left and up a few yards there and on up into meeting a back wall. That, in other words, the yard itself was an enclosed area. Now in that enclosed area, and on the outer part of it here, you had buildings that were there in my young days and where my father used to keep some of his stock, and I was used to going in and out of them myself. On my left here, there was a forge, another part of the establishment, where you can imagine how important the forge was to racing stables and to farmyards, horses and what have you. Within the building here there was a laundry and there was a sawmill, and there were stabling for the cattle and the farm horses, and the odd presence of a horse from the stables beyond was mentioned here. It was mentioned in George's. He gives a great account of it in his book, part of his Hail and Farewell Valley, the third edition part of it. I used to be in there in the barn area cutting slits, what we used to call slits for sowing potatoes. You cut up each potato into what we used to call slits. The Moors, I'm sure, brought up their produce up that dark road from their farm. And so did my father, and I myself would have brought some of the produce up of our farm up through the dark road there. So there was that continuity of use right down to the time when John O'Hare took over the place and we no longer had any access to it. John O'Hare was a timber merchant, and he was from, he used to be a foreman working with McCartans of Hollymount, and McCartans of Hollymount have survived to the present day, I think, in some, over in Bloomfield House, I think is the name of the place. And both John O'Hare and the McCartans would have come from the north of Ireland, Newry, or around the Newry area, I think. And old John O'Hare was a regular visitor in our house when I was a child, and he used to come in for a drink of buttermilk or whatever, and he was part of my childhood scene. And his sawmill, of course, was a marvellous place for a child like myself, you know, and I spent a lot of my young days there and even helped out the men making egg boxes and things like that. It was a very exciting era around Moorehall. The sawmill was up on the Ballinrobe Road there, up from our house, just a couple of hundred yards from our house. And the sound of the sawmill would have been there, and we were used to the sound of the saws working, the old saws. There isn't a trace of it there now, only overgrown with an extraordinary growth of scrub of one kind or another.